When I pulled into the quiet cul-de-sac that bordered the stretch of land my grandfather had left me, I could almost hear the echoes of my childhood summers. The lazy afternoons spent chasing fireflies, the smell of freshly cut grass, the way the lake at the back of the property glimmered in the sun like a sheet of glass. It had been more than 15 years since I had last walked these streets, and though the neighborhood had changed, it still had that air of tightly wound perfection. Identical lawns cut with military precision, pastel-colored houses lined up like soldiers, and the occasional sight of a resident clutching their clipboard as though it was a badge of honor. It didn't take me long to realize this community was no longer just a friendly suburban area. It had evolved or devolved into a homeowners association fiefdom. The kind of place where rules were sacred scripture and neighbors reported each other for daring to grow daisies instead of tulips. My grandfather had always told me the HOA was a nuisance when they expanded their reach into the neighborhood, but back then he managed to live peacefully on the edge of town, largely ignored because his land was technically separate, larger, and older than the subdivision. Now, with him gone and the deed in my name, I was determined to honor his memory, but as I drove down the main street with my U-Haul in tow, I could already see the stares from people watering their lawns or retrieving their mail, their faces scrunching as if they'd caught the scent of something sour. And then, before I had even parked in front of the old farmhouse that stood proud in its slightly weathered but dignified condition, she appeared, Karen. She was exactly what the caricature in my head would have predicted: short blonde bob cut sharp enough to slice paper, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose even though the sun had started dipping, and an expression that looked like she'd bitten into a lemon but refused to spit it out. She marched across the street, clipboard in hand, her flip-flops smacking the pavement with alarming authority. I hadn't even shut off the engine before she rapped on my window with her manicured nails, motioning for me to lower it. "Excuse me," she began, her tone already carrying that mix of indignation and entitlement that screamed volumes about her personality. "You can't just park a moving truck here without HOA clearance. This is a private community." I smiled politely, rolling the window all the way down, because something told me this was going to be a conversation worth savoring. "Actually," I said, gesturing toward the farmhouse, "this is my property. I inherited it from my grandfather. I'll just be unloading here." She narrowed her eyes, clearly unimpressed by both my explanation and my calm tone. "Inherited, you say? Well, regardless of what you think this is, all properties in this area fall under the Homeowners Association, and we have very strict guidelines. Moving trucks must be scheduled in advance, unloading can't block the street, and all renovations or changes to a house must be approved by the board, of which I am the president." The way she said president was heavy with self-importance, like she was announcing she had been elected head of a small country. I let her finish, leaning an elbow out of the window, before I replied with a measured patience that I knew would irritate her. "That's interesting, but you might want to check your records again, because my land doesn't fall under the HOA's jurisdiction. It predates the subdivision by decades. My grandfather built this house long before these cookie-cutter homes cropped up." Karen gave a tight-lipped smile that wasn't a smile at all, just a grimace disguised as one. "That's impossible," she said. "All homes here are subject to our rules. If you're planning on staying, you'll need to attend our next meeting and sign the covenant agreement." At this point, I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs, and stood tall enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to keep eye contact. "I don't think you understand. I own this land, and as of last week, when the probate finished, it's officially in my name. That means you don't get to tell me when I can park, what flowers I can plant, or what color I can paint the shutters. And I'm definitely not signing any covenant." A few of the neighbors had gathered at a polite distance now, pretending to be out for evening strolls while clearly listening in. Karen's cheeks flushed a blotchy red, and I could tell she wasn't used to being challenged. She probably thrived on intimidation, on the meek compliance of others who didn't want to rock the suburban boat. But I had inherited more than just land. I had inherited my grandfather's stubbornness, his refusal to bow to petty authority. "Well," she said, adjusting her sunglasses as though the gesture alone restored her superiority, "we'll see what the board has to say about that. I'll be sending you a copy of the rules, and I expect you to read them thoroughly. You may think you're exempt, but trust me, nobody gets a free pass here." She turned on her heel with the dramatic flair of someone leaving a courtroom drama, her flip-flops clapping indignantly as she stormed away. I shook my head, suppressing a laugh. If only she knew what I knew. The deed not only gave me the farmhouse and surrounding acreage, but it also included the small strip of land at the entrance of the subdivision, the very piece on which the HOA office trailer sat. My grandfather had always been wily about keeping that fact quiet, knowing one day it would come in handy. And now, as I watched Karen scurry back to her perfectly manicured house across the street, muttering to herself and scribbling furiously on her clipboard, I realized that day had come. She thought she was the queen of this neighborhood, but she was about to learn the truth. The land she lorded over didn't belong to her. It belonged to me. The first night in my grandfather's house was quiet, though not the peaceful kind of quiet I had remembered as a child. It was the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath, as though the neighborhood itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I unpacked a few boxes, wandered through the creaky hallways that still smelled faintly of cedar and old books, and eventually sat out on the porch with a beer, watching the sun dip below the trees. The house had aged gracefully, needing a few updates here and there, but it still radiated a sense of pride. I thought about the stories my grandfather used to tell me about standing his ground against anyone who tried to strong-arm him, and I realized that his spirit seemed to linger in the rafters, urging me not to let this Karen or anyone else dictate how I lived on what was mine. Early the next morning, I got my first taste of what life under her self-proclaimed reign was like. I stepped outside to grab the newspaper. Yes, unbelievably, this neighborhood still had paper delivery, and found a thick packet tucked under a rubber band placed neatly on my porch. Across the front, in bold capital letters, were the words, "Mandatory HOA Guidelines." I didn't even have to open it to know where it came from. Sure enough, tucked inside was a handwritten note on pastel stationery adorned with little flowers. "Welcome to the community. As president of the HOA, I expect you to familiarize yourself with these rules immediately. Failure to comply may result in fines and/or further action. We will be watching closely. Sincerely, Karen." The audacity made me laugh out loud, though the laugh was short-lived as I spotted her across the street, peeking through her blinds like a watchdog with too much time on her hands. She probably expected me to call her or come knocking on her door, hat in hand, asking for forgiveness for my so-called infractions. Instead, I tucked the packet under my arm, walked straight to the recycling bin, and dropped it in with deliberate slowness, making sure she could see every motion. Sure enough, her blinds snapped shut as though she'd been caught in the act. By noon, 2 more concerned neighbors had made their way over with carefully rehearsed pleasantries, pretending to welcome me while gently hinting that I should really attend the HOA's upcoming meeting. One man, a balding fellow named Bob, nervously mentioned that Karen had a lot of influence around here, and it would be easier for everyone if I just went along with things. I smiled politely but offered no promises, and when he shuffled away, I could see Karen's shadow on her porch, arms folded, watching the exchange like a general inspecting her troops. It was almost entertaining to see how orchestrated the whole charade was. But what none of them knew, what none of them could know yet, was that the balance of power was not in their clipboard-wielding queen's hands. After lunch, I decided to take a walk down to the edge of the property to the entrance where a modest trailer sat tucked against a row of hedges. It was small and unassuming, but a fresh sign outside labeled it as the HOA office. I remembered when my grandfather had chuckled about this years ago, telling me the association had begged to lease a piece of land from him for their operations because it was technically the only space that fit their zoning needs. He'd agreed, knowing full well that the land would always remain his, and in the end he'd ensured that clause stayed ironclad in the deed. As I stood there now, tracing my hand over the chain-link fence that separated the office from the street, I couldn't help but grin. They thought they were the landlords of this whole neighborhood, but they were just tenants on my property, and tenants came with rules too. I wasn't in any rush to reveal that card yet. The suspense was almost too delicious. I wanted to see how far Karen would go, how deep she'd dig herself into her pit of arrogance before I lowered the boom. That afternoon, though, she wasted no time striking again. I was carrying in a box of books when I heard a sharp rap on the door. Opening it, I found Karen standing there without her clipboard for once, which almost made her look less formidable until she spoke. "You've already violated 3 rules," she declared without greeting, pointing toward my driveway. 1. Your grass is above regulation length. 2. You left your trash bins visible past the allowed time. 3. Your truck has been parked for more than 24 hours. Her tone was clipped, her words delivered with the precision of someone who'd been rehearsing them all morning. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Karen," I said evenly, "with all due respect, none of your rules apply to me. My land is outside your jurisdiction." Her nostrils flared, and she took a deep breath, as if summoning patience from some hidden reserve. "You can claim that all you want, but until you've proven otherwise, you are expected to comply. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to escalate this matter with fines and potential legal action." Her attempt at intimidation almost worked. I say almost because she delivered it with such seriousness that I had to stifle a chuckle. "You do that," I said finally, "but don't be surprised if the outcome isn't what you expect." She studied me for a long moment, clearly thrown off by my calmness, before she spun on her heel and stomped back across the street, barking at a teenager who'd parked his bike on the sidewalk. Watching her retreat, I realized she was digging herself deeper with every move, and the irony was almost poetic. The so-called queen of the HOA was about to learn that the throne she sat on wasn't hers at all, it was rented. By the 3rd day, it was clear Karen had declared war, though instead of armies and weapons, her arsenal consisted of printer paper passive-aggressive notes and the kind of bureaucracy that could drive even the sanest person mad. I woke up to find not 1 but 3 envelopes taped to my door, each stamped with bold red letters that read "Notice of Infraction." The first accused me of failing to maintain aesthetic uniformity because my shutters were faded. The second claimed my front porch light was not in compliance with HOA brightness standards. And the third, in what had to be her crowning act of absurdity, fined me $50 for having an unauthorized bird feeder hanging from the oak tree in the front yard. I laughed so hard at that last one that I nearly choked on my coffee because the feeder had been there since my grandfather installed it decades ago, and no one in their right mind could possibly consider a wooden birdhouse a threat to neighborhood harmony. But Karen wasn't operating in the realm of reason. She thrived on control, on wearing people down until they submitted. I could almost picture her in her kitchen late at night, surrounded by rulebooks and highlighters, scribbling out violation notices like a general plotting her battle strategy. Still, while her obsession was laughable to me, it was starting to stir tension among the neighbors. A few came by cautiously, like diplomats trying to negotiate peace, urging me to just pay the fines or attend one meeting to smooth things over. One woman even whispered that it was better not to get on Karen's bad side, because she knew how to make life miserable. I thanked them for their concern, but remained unmoved, because what they didn't realize was that Karen's threats were smoke and mirrors. She was writing checks with her pen that she couldn't cash, not on land that was legally mine and outside her grasp. Still, I had no intention of playing all my cards too soon. Instead, I decided to let her dig her own grave, to let her escalate until the neighborhood was so tightly wound in her web that the snap of the truth would echo twice as loud. To that end, I started making subtle moves, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of the people who came to me. When Bob returned one evening, wringing his hands about the bad example I was setting, I asked him quietly if he'd ever actually read the original covenant or deed restrictions. He blinked at me, confused, before admitting he hadn't. "Karen handles all that," he muttered. I nodded, as if I'd expected as much, and said simply, "You might want to check for yourself one day. You'd be surprised what you'll find." I left it at that, knowing the hint would gnaw at him. Likewise, when another neighbor named Linda stopped by to complain about my non-compliant garbage bins, I asked if she was happy paying HOA dues every month when half of those dues went toward maintaining the little office at the subdivision entrance. "Wouldn't it be funny," I said with a smile, "if the HOA didn't even own the land under their own building? She laughed nervously, assuming I was joking, but I could see the flicker of curiosity in her eyes as she left. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down on her campaign. She began holding impromptu community inspections, striding up and down the sidewalks with her clipboard, pointing out potential violations to anyone unlucky enough to be outside. I watched from my porch one afternoon as she scolded a young mother for letting her children chalk the driveway, claiming it was graffiti. Another day, she berated an elderly man for hanging laundry on his back fence where it could be seen from the street. It was like watching a dictator tighten her grip, and the neighborhood, once full of polite nods and neighborly waves, now buzzed with unease. People whispered, avoided eye contact, and darted into their homes like nervous subjects under surveillance. And still she sent me notices, each more ridiculous than the last: fines for having a mismatched garden hose, warnings about non-regulation mulch color, and even a threat to tow my pickup truck if I didn't move it into a garage, though the farmhouse had never had a garage in the first place. I collected the notices in a shoebox, amused, almost treating them like baseball cards in a bizarre collection of Karen's greatest hits. And while she played her hand louder and harsher, I worked quietly behind the scenes, meeting with the attorney who had helped finalize my grandfather's estate, confirming every clause of the deed and lease agreement with the HOA's office land. Not only was I beyond her reach, but the association itself was technically my tenant, bound by an agreement that could be altered or terminated at my discretion. The irony was sweeter than honey. Every violation, notice she pushed under my nose, every fine she tacked on, was just fuel for the fire I was letting her build, a fire I intended to extinguish in front of the entire neighborhood. The timing just had to be right. When Karen finally announced that the next HOA meeting was mandatory and attendance would be enforced, I knew the opportunity had arrived. Flyers appeared in every mailbox, written in bold, almost threatening language, warning of serious consequences for those who failed to attend. She wanted a stage to showcase her power, to shame me publicly and remind everyone who ruled this subdivision. But what she didn't realize was that I had been waiting for exactly that moment, the perfect audience, the perfect stage, and the perfect opportunity to pull the rug out from under her once and for all. The night of the HOA meeting arrived like the climax of a long brewing storm, thick with anticipation and tension, and as I walked down the sidewalk toward the small trailer at the subdivision entrance that served as their so-called headquarters, I could feel eyes following me from behind blinds and half-open doors, neighbors curious to see how the clash between the self-proclaimed queen and the new unbowed landowner would unfold. The trailer was lit brightly, buzzing like a hive, with folding chairs packed in rows and every seat filled by the usual suspects: retirees clutching clipboards, parents balancing toddlers, and younger couples who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. At the front of the room stood Karen, of course, her blonde bob immaculately styled, a stack of folders arranged neatly in front of her, and that smug, tight smile plastered on her face like she was the star of the show. She spotted me the moment I stepped inside, her eyes narrowing, and she leaned over to whisper something to the man sitting beside her, who I assumed was the treasurer. The whispering set off a ripple of murmurs across the room, as though everyone was waiting for a showdown. I took a seat in the back, calm and unhurried, and folded my arms, letting her have her opening act. "Thank you all for coming," she began in a tone that dripped with self-importance, tapping the microphone, even though the room was small enough for everyone to hear her without it. As president of the Homeowners Association, it's my duty to ensure this community remains a safe, orderly, and beautiful place to live. Unfortunately, and here she let her eyes slide deliberately in my direction, we've had some issues with a new resident who seems unwilling to comply with our standards. Tonight, we'll be discussing the necessary steps to address these violations. A few heads turned toward me, some sympathetic, others wary, and Karen basked in the attention like a cat, soaking up sunlight. She launched into a slideshow presentation, each slide more absurd than the last, listing my so-called infractions with photographs she had clearly taken herself: the unauthorized bird feeder, the faded shutters, the truck in the driveway. Each time she flipped to a new slide, she paused dramatically, waiting for gasps of disapproval, Though most people only shifted uncomfortably, too polite to laugh, but clearly unconvinced this warranted such a spectacle. I watched quietly, noting how desperate she was to prove her power, to turn the crowd against me with her paper-thin arguments. When she finally finished her performance and turned to face the room, I could feel the expectant silence pressing in, everyone waiting for me to defend myself. She crossed her arms and tilted her chin, smug, certain she had backed me into a corner. "Do you have anything you'd like to say for yourself?" she asked, her voice syrupy but edged with venom. I stood slowly, stretching my back as though I'd just been woken from a nap, and took my time walking to the front of the room. The murmurs grew louder. Karen's smile faltered just slightly, betraying her impatience. When I reached the microphone, I looked out over the crowd, recognizing faces I'd seen on my grandfather's porch when I was a kid, people who had once shared lemonade with him or borrowed tools for his shed. I let that memory anchor me before I spoke. "First, I'd like to thank you all for welcoming me back," I said, my voice calm but carrying easily in the small space. "This house, this land, has been in my family for generations. My grandfather built it long before most of these homes existed, and I intend to honor it as he did, by living here, maintaining it, and being a good neighbor." A few heads nodded, and I saw flickers of warmth in some eyes, reminders that not everyone was aligned with Karen's crusade. Now, I continued, pulling a thick folder from under my arm. "Regarding these alleged violations, I've consulted with my attorney, and I have documentation to prove what I already knew. My property is not and never has been under HOA jurisdiction. It predates the subdivision and was never signed into the covenant. Which means, respectfully, Karen, your rules don't apply to me." Gasps rippled through the crowd, some startled, some amused, and Karen's face darkened to the shade of ripe tomatoes. She leaned forward, sputtering, That's not possible. All homes in this area are bound by our covenant." I flipped open the folder and held up the deed, clearly marked with dates older than the subdivision itself. "This is my deed, signed and notarized. And here," I added, pulling out another document, "is the lease agreement that my grandfather made with the HOA years ago when you all requested to use part of his land for this office." The room erupted into murmurs, louder this time, as people turned to look at one another with wide eyes. I let the silence settle just long enough before I delivered the final blow. "So, technically," I said with a faint smile, "not only am I not bound by your rules, but this office you're holding this meeting in, it's sitting on my land, which makes me, in a very real sense, your landlord." The reaction was instant and explosive. Some people laughed outright, others gasped, and a few clapped their hands over their mouths in disbelief. Karen, on the other hand, looked like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her carefully rehearsed authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. She snatched up a folder from the table, rifling through papers as if she could somehow conjure evidence to contradict me, but the harder she searched, the more frantic she became. The treasurer beside her leaned in to look at the documents I'd produced, and I saw his face pale when he realized they were legitimate. This is absurd." Karen finally shrieked, slamming the folder shut. "He's lying. He has to be lying." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her panic, and the neighbors, once hesitant to question her, now whispered freely among themselves, their loyalty slipping through her fingers like sand. I stood tall, calm as a stone, and added, "I'm not here to cause problems. I want to live peacefully, just as my grandfather did, but I won't be bullied with false fines and imaginary rules. And I think everyone here deserves to know that if your association is being run this way, on fear, intimidation, and misinformation, then maybe it's time to ask who really benefits from all these rules." The murmurs swelled into open discussion now, people shifting in their chairs, nodding, frowning at Karen, questioning her authority out loud. Her face was a mask of fury and disbelief, but she was cornered, trapped by the very stage she had built to humiliate me. The days following the HOA meeting were unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before, and the once tightly wound, rule-obsessed community began to crack open, as if Karen's iron grip had finally loosened. For years, she had ruled through fear, fines, and the endless parade of clipboard inspections. But now, whispers spread from porch to porch, over hedges, and across driveways about how the new guy had stood up to her and revealed the truth she had worked so hard to bury. I couldn't walk to the mailbox without someone stopping me to ask if it was really true that the HOA office sat on my land, or if I had really shown documents proving I was exempt from their rules. Each time, I nodded calmly, confirming what they had seen with their own eyes, and I could feel their confidence in Karen's authority deflate a little more. Some even laughed about it in hushed tones, saying it was poetic justice that their queen bee had been dethroned in the very hive she thought she controlled. Karen, of course, refused to admit defeat, and within 24 hours of the meeting, she was back at it, sending out a mass email that dripped with desperation, insisting that the so-called deed I had produced was fraudulent, that I was spreading lies to undermine the integrity of the HOA, and that anyone siding with me was putting their property values at risk. It might have worked in the past when her words carried unchecked weight, but now the neighbors had tasted the possibility that she wasn't infallible, and doubt is a poison that spreads quickly once planted. People began questioning her decisions out loud. At the weekly yard sale, I overheard two elderly women who had always been among her staunchest supporters whispering that perhaps Karen had gone too far with her graffiti crackdown on children's chalk drawings, and maybe, just maybe, she'd exaggerated my so-called violations. One man even approached me directly, asking if I'd be willing to show him the deed myself, and when I pulled out a copy from my folder and let him read it, he nodded slowly, muttering that he'd been paying dues for years without ever really knowing what the bylaws said. The shift was subtle at first, but it was there. People were waking up, realizing they had ceded too much power to someone who thrived on control. Karen, sensing her empire crumbling, doubled down with a ferocity that bordered on comical. She began issuing fines left and right, not just to me, but to anyone who so much as left a trash bin visible or parked a car an inch over the curb. She thought that by tightening her grip, she could scare everyone back into line, but the opposite happened. The more she fined, the more resistance she bred. Neighbors who had once dutifully complied began grumbling openly, questioning why their money was going into the HOA's coffers for things that didn't benefit them. The treasurer, a meek man named Harold, even approached me privately one evening, his voice low, as if confessing a sin, telling me that he had no choice but to process Karen's fines, but that he was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the sheer volume she was pushing through. It's not sustainable, he admitted, shaking his head. People are angry, and if they start withholding dues, we're in trouble. I could see the worry in his eyes, the dawning realization that the empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. I told him calmly that change was coming, that all it would take was enough people willing to speak up at the next meeting, and for the first time in years, I saw hope instead of fear flicker in the eyes of someone under Karen's thumb. Meanwhile, Karen herself began avoiding me in public, which was almost more satisfying than any confrontation. Where she had once stormed across the street to bark orders and hand me violation slips, now she crossed to the opposite sidewalk. If she saw me coming, her shoulders stiff, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. But I knew her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She was scheming, plotting a new way to regain her throne. And sure enough, a week later, a letter appeared in every mailbox announcing that she was calling an emergency HOA vote to decide on new rules that would restore order and protect property values. The irony, of course, was that she had chosen to hold this emergency vote once again in the little office at the subdivision entrance, the very office that sat on my land. She never learned, or perhaps she was so blinded by her need for control that she couldn't see the trap she was walking into. I decided then that I wouldn't just defend myself anymore, I would go on the offensive. I called my attorney again, asked him to prepare the necessary paperwork to remind the HOA of its lease terms, and even drafted a polite but firm notice of my rights as their landlord. If Karen wanted to drag this community into another public display of power, I would be ready to show everyone just how flimsy her crown really was. The thought of her face when I pulled out those documents made me smile as I leaned back on my porch, listening to the crickets and feeling, for the first time since I'd returned, that the land was settling into my hands the way my grandfather had intended. It wasn't just a house or acreage I'd inherited, it was the chance to break the cycle of fear and remind people that no one, not even the loudest voice with a clipboard, had the right to dictate their lives. The evening of Karen's so-called emergency HOA vote arrived with the air of a final showdown, and as I made my way down the familiar path toward the trailer that served as the association's headquarters, I could sense the anticipation buzzing through the neighborhood like static before a thunderstorm. People were gathered in clusters on sidewalks and lawns, whispering, speculating, their faces caught between curiosity and hope because everyone knew this meeting would not be like the others. The little office was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it, folding chairs overflowing, neighbors crammed shoulder to shoulder, and Karen sat at the front table like a captain determined to go down with her ship, her bob perfectly styled, her sunglasses perched on her head, her stack of folders arranged like weapons at the ready. She stood the moment I entered, her voice sharp as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you for attending on such short notice. It has come to my attention that misinformation has been spread, misinformation that threatens the safety, order, and property values of our beloved community. Tonight, we will vote on new emergency measures to restore compliance and ensure that every resident, yes, every resident, is bound by the same rules." She let her eyes linger on me with a triumphant gleam, as if daring me to contradict her. I stayed silent for the moment, taking a seat in the back, letting her revel in her theatrics. She launched into her speech, whipping through slides of violations around the neighborhood. Chalk drawings, laundry lines, cars parked an inch over driveways, painting a picture of chaos that only her iron fist could restore. But unlike before, the room wasn't hanging on her every word. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, people exchanging glances, some even rolling their eyes. The air had shifted, and Karen was too blinded by her need to dominate to notice. When she finally called for a vote, declaring that anyone not in favor of her emergency measures was siding with anarchy, I rose from my chair, folder in hand, and made my way slowly to the front. The room quieted, the murmurs replaced with a thick silence, and Karen's triumphant smile faltered as I placed my folder on the table beside her neat stack of fines. "Before you all vote," I said calmly, turned to face the crowd, "there are a few things you deserve to know." I pulled out the first document, a certified copy of my deed, the same one I'd shown before, and held it high for everyone to see. This land, my grandfather's land, predates the HOA. It was never signed into the covenant. I am not bound by HOA rules, and Karen knows this. She's been fining me illegally, and if she's done it to me, you should ask yourselves what else she's been hiding. A murmur of agreement swept through the room, louder this time, and I saw heads nodding, lips pursing in thought. Karen slammed her hand on the table, her voice shrill. "Lies! None of this is legitimate. He's trying to dismantle everything we've built here." I ignored her and pulled out the second document, the lease agreement my grandfather had signed with the HOA, granting them use of this very office. Gasps echoed as I read aloud the key clause, that the lease was subject to termination at the landowner's discretion. "This office you're sitting in," I said, my voice steady but firm, "is on my property. That makes me your landlord. And as your landlord, I have the legal right to revoke this lease if I choose." The reaction was instant, a wave of whispers that swelled into open disbelief, and even laughter, people turning to one another with wide eyes as the realization sank in. Karen's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like she was choking on her own authority. That's impossible," she stammered. But Harold, the treasurer, was already leaning forward, his eyes scanning the documents I'd placed on the table. His face turned ashen as he looked up, confirming what everyone suspected. "It's true," he said quietly, his voice carrying like a gavel strike in the silence. "The office sits on his land." The room erupted, neighbors talking over each other now, some laughing, some clapping, others demanding answers from Karen. The Queen had no clothes, and everyone could see it. I raised my hand for quiet, and slowly, reluctantly, the noise died down. I don't want to revoke your lease, I said clearly. I don't want to throw anyone out or cause chaos. But I also won't stand by while someone abuses their position to bully and exploit their neighbors. This community deserves better. You deserve transparency, fairness, and respect, not fear. A cheer rose from the back of the room, tentative at first, then stronger as more people joined in. Karen, red-faced and trembling, tried to shout over the noise, insisting I was manipulating them, but the tide had turned, and for once, no one was listening. People began standing, openly calling for her resignation, demanding a new election, shouting that they were tired of fines for bird feeders and chalk drawings. Even those who had once been her staunchest supporters were shaking their heads, embarrassed to have followed her for so long. Karen grabbed her folders in a frenzy, shoving them into her bag as if she could pack away her collapsing kingdom, and with one final furious glare at me, she stormed out of the office, her flip-flops smacking the pavement in retreat. The room erupted into applause. Not for me, but for the release of years of pent-up frustration, for the collective sigh of a community finally freed from its tyrant. Harold stood awkwardly at the front, promising to organize a fair election, and neighbors began talking excitedly about changes they wanted to see, voices alive with possibility. I stood quietly to the side, letting them reclaim their space, content in knowing my grandfather would have been proud of the stand I'd taken. As I walked back home under the glow of the streetlights, the air felt lighter, the houses less uniform and more alive. And though I knew Karen wouldn't vanish so easily, people like her rarely do, I also knew she had lost her throne for good. And as I stepped onto the porch of the farmhouse, the land beneath my feet steady and sure, I realized that I hadn't just inherited property. I'd inherited a chance to reshape a community, to remind people that no clipboard or self-appointed queen could take away their right to live freely.